So stupid. Why did I stay silent back then? I should have stood up, said everything, instead of letting it all pass like nothing ever happened. I'm Emily Walker, the overlooked eldest daughter in a family that worshipped their golden boy. But that was before I made them all bow, in my own boardroom. What would you do if the very family that once looked down on you had to watch you take the CEO seat in their own company? Would you forgive, or let them taste what it feels like to be forgotten? If you were in that situation, how would you handle it? Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated like that? Don't scroll away, because what's coming next is when the truth starts to unravel. Stay with me. This story is just getting started. I never thought the day I stood under the crystal lights of the Imperial Grand Hotel would be the day I saw most clearly the cracks in what had once seemed like a perfect family picture. I stood at the far end of the wedding hall, fingers lightly gripping a half-empty glass of champagne. My simple navy blue dress hugged my body like silent armor. Around me, the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and classical music floated in the air, making the whole scene feel like an over-directed movie. Everyone here had a reason to hold their heads high. They saw themselves as successful, as winners. Especially Daniel, my younger brother, who today would marry the daughter of the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, the very company where he held the title of youngest vice president in its history. I was different. From their point of view, I was just the quiet, unremarkable older sister, always vaguely saying I was working in consulting, though no one ever really asked what that meant. Truth is, they never really wanted to know. I used to wonder if that was my fault, choosing silence, never correcting them, never arguing. I let them believe I was working for a small firm, when in reality I was the founder and CEO of Lara Consulting, one of the most influential financial advisory firms in America. Some truths are kept not out of fear, but because no one truly cares enough to ask. "Emily!" My mother's voice pulled me back to the present. She walked over quickly, her eyes scanning me as if assessing whether I fit in with this upper-class gathering. Her gaze paused at my unbranded, plain-colored dress, and her lips tightened. "You should be more sociable. Everyone's asking about you." I smiled faintly and nodded, saying nothing. She looked at me for a few seconds longer, then shook her head and walked away. I remember when Daniel was first hired by Sterling Dynamics. The whole family threw a celebration. My father called it a triumph for us all. But when I pitched the idea of starting my own company, they called it a childish fantasy and urged me to be more realistic. Everything I've built over the past 10 years they've never seen, or more accurately, never wanted to see. I lightly touched the old pendant necklace I wore, a keepsake from my grandmother. The only person in the family who ever said to me, "If they don't believe in you, build something they can't ignore." Daniel entered the hall like royalty. That same confident stride, the arrogant gleam in his eyes, and that signature half-smile, the smile of someone who truly believes the world revolves around him. I was used to that. Back in school, and even now as adults, Daniel had always been the golden child, lifted up by our parents, while I was just the smart but impractical eldest daughter. Beside him stood Jessica, his soon-to-be wife, the picture-perfect image of a corporate bride. Long, curled blonde hair, a wedding gown as white as clouds, and eyes brimming with admiration for all things shiny. They didn't see me, or maybe they just didn't recognize me. I took another sip of champagne. It was almost funny. I used to fantasize about revealing my true identity, at a press conference, in a headline-grabbing business deal, or at the very least, during a family dinner, where someone would finally ask, "So what is it that you actually do, Emily?" But no, I was here, at a wedding where I was just another forgettable guest, and I planned to keep everything under wraps, as usual. So why did my heart feel so unsettled? Was I hoping for something different from them? Part of me wanted to stay quiet, to let the event play out as expected. But another part, stronger and more defiant, was whispering that it was time for the truth to speak. As I stood alone near the entrance, I caught a glimpse of my family's reflection in a tall glass wall. Daniel and Jessica laughing with guests, my parents glowing with pride, and me, as always, standing outside the frame. The last family photo we took together was 8 years ago. I had just launched Lyra. I stood off to the side wearing a second-hand dress from a vintage market, while everyone else wore designer brands. I remember the way my father looked at that photo, as if there was something in it that didn't belong, and in that moment, I decided I didn't need anyone's permission anymore. I'd walk my own path, alone. "Are you ready?" I heard my mother ask behind me. I turned around and met her gaze, and for the first time that evening, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she no longer knew what I was thinking. I gave a slight nod, set my glass down, adjusted my dress, and walked toward the center of the hall. The music shifted key. The main doors opened, and in walked James Harrison, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, lowering the temperature of the room by several degrees. I knew him. We'd held 3 virtual meetings in the past month, discussing plans to merge his company into my firm. But he had never seen me in person, and he had no idea I was Daniel's sister. His eyes swept the room, and then stopped on me. My heart pounded. Not out of fear, but because I knew that in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. James Harrison, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, entered like a cold wind on a summer night. No one said a word, yet the entire room fell into silence. The music continued to play, but it felt as though no one could hear it anymore. He wasn't tall in a commanding way, but there was something about him that demanded attention, the aura of a man whose decisions had once shaken the stock market. His charcoal gray suit was flawlessly tailored, a deep blue tie at his neck, and eyes sharp as a blade. Daniel immediately straightened his back, abruptly abandoning his conversation to stride toward the door, dragging Jessica along like a scene rehearsed in advance. I didn't move. No need to rush, no need to perform, because Mr. Harrison's eyes, after sweeping the room, had stopped on me. And then, the unexpected happened. "Ms. Walker," he said, with both surprise and relief in his voice. "I didn't think I'd see you here." The air around me thickened. Heads began to turn. Daniel froze mid-step, his legs still moving but his face turned to stone. Jessica stopped too, her gaze shifting between me and Mr. Harrison, unable to comprehend what was happening. I placed my champagne glass on the nearby table, straightened my posture as though stepping onto a stage that had been waiting for me my entire life. "Hello, James," I said with a smile. "I didn't expect to see you at a family event like this." I could feel Daniel's eyes boring into me, as if trying to stop the conversation with a glare alone. But it was too late. Mr. Harrison stepped forward and shook my hand with a respect rarely seen in rooms like these. "We've been trying to arrange a meeting with you for weeks, and now, here you are, at the wedding of one of our employees. Wait." He paused, realization dawning. "You're Daniel's sister?" I gave a slight nod. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, who looked like the life had been drained from his body, then back to me, his brows rising as if a puzzle had just completed itself in his mind. The silence in the room was no longer ordinary silence. It was the hush of collective shock, a silent slap to the faces of those who had once smirked at me in my plain dress and so-called small-time consulting job. I looked at Daniel. His face had gone pale, as though every cell in his skin was screaming, "Impossible." But it was the truth. The older sister he had belittled, the one always seen as on the sidelines, was actually the founder of the very firm negotiating to acquire the company he worked for. And he had no idea. Jessica stood frozen. The glass in her hand slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp crack that snapped the entire room out of its daze. Whispers began, soft at first, then spreading rapidly like flames across dry grass. Murmurs, sideways glances, lips pressed close to ears. I said nothing. I let the truth speak for itself. My mother came forward, her hands trembling slightly, her face drained of all color. "Emily, my dear." I lifted a freshly poured glass of wine, smiling politely. "You never really asked what I did you, Mom?" She opened her mouth as if to reply, then closed it again. I turned to Mr. Harrison. "About the merger, Perhaps after the ceremony we can revisit a few of the terms. Daniel snapped out of his trance. He hurried over, clutching my hand, voice cracking. Wait, merger? What are you talking about? I calmly released his grip. What Mr. Harrison and I have been discussing recently, Lyra Consulting is considering acquiring Sterling Dynamics. I paused for a beat. But after today, I'm not so sure anymore. My words landed like a blade against Daniel's pride. He stumbled back a step, mouth open, but no words came out. My father stepped in, his voice hoarse. Hold on, Emily. What are you saying? This is your brother's wedding, not the place to fabricate things that can't be verified. Mr. Harrison spoke, his voice low but steady. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, but your daughter isn't exaggerating. She is, in fact, the head of Lyra Consulting, and the person we've been waiting to meet to finalize one of this year's biggest deals. I didn't look at my father. I looked at my mother. She still stood there, lost, broken, as if realizing she had missed something monumental. Jessica whispered, Daniel, did you know about this? Daniel shook his head, lips quivering. She's always been jealous. That must be it. She made this up to ruin the wedding. I looked him in the eyes. You always called me the sister with the little consulting job, but you never once asked what company it was. No one said another word. No one needed to. Every denial now was meaningless. The shadows in the family portrait had dissolved. The truth had surfaced. And the most ironic part, it didn't take a grand speech. Just presence, a glance, and a well-timed handshake. I turned away, leaving behind a stunned family and a wedding hall now quieter than an abandoned church. Perhaps this was the answer I had never needed, but always longed for. The door to the private lounge closed behind me with a heavy thud, like the final punctuation mark on the kind of family I once belonged to. The room was utterly silent. Soft yellow light from the chandelier glinted off the mirrored wall, shimmering, but cold. I sat down on a red velvet chair, facing my parents and Daniel, who stood together like they were clinging to one another in hopes of restoring some order to the chaos that had just unfolded. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice faltered slightly. Emily, why did you hide all of this? I didn't answer right away. I looked at her for a long moment, not to punish her, but to see, for once, if she truly wanted to hear the answer. Because you never asked, I said softly. Yet each word hit the walls like a thunderclap in their minds. Daniel suddenly stood up, cutting in sharply. This isn't fair. You did all of this just to ruin me, didn't you? Why today? I looked at him. His eyes no longer resembled the Daniel I used to know. They were the eyes of a lost child, confused, hurt, on the brink of unraveling. But I couldn't allow myself to waver. I didn't choose today. You all did. I tightened my palm, feeling the cold metal of my grandmother's pendant, a quiet reminder to stay strong. I didn't plan anything, but when I was mocked by my own brother, humiliated in front of a crowd for my insignificant little job, I realized it was time. My father stepped forward, his voice gravelly. But Emily, you're my daughter. You're part of this family. No matter what happens, we're still one. I laughed. Not from joy, but from something deep and long broken finally snapping free. One family? I repeated the words, testing how they felt on my tongue. I stood up and walked toward them. When I dropped out of college to start my business, what did you say, Dad? That a girl with no experience shouldn't set herself up to fail. When I landed my first contract, Mom said it was just luck. When I needed money to rent an office, Daniel borrowed my last savings for his MBA and never paid it back. I turned to my mother. And you laughed. You said, Daniel needs it more. No one argued. No one denied it. Because they knew I wasn't making anything up. And now, the moment I'm no longer in the shadows, everyone suddenly asks, why didn't you tell us? I stepped back to my seat and crossed my arms. Because none of you ever listened. Daniel slumped into a chair. his usual confident posture now curled inward, pitiful and small. He mumbled, "So all of it was fake? My position, my future, it's going to vanish if the merger goes through?" I didn't respond right away. I looked at him like I was trying to find the younger brother I used to share food with, cover for, care about. "Your position," I said slowly, "was never built on merit. It was built on favors, on protection, on illusion. And when those things collapse, what's left?" He didn't answer. He just bowed his head, hands tightly clenched together. My father stepped forward again, his tone shifting into negotiation. "If you now have influence over this merger, why don't we find a way to work together? Build something, for the sake of the family." I smiled, a soft smile, but one sharp enough to cut. For the family was never for me. It was always about Daniel, about the perfect image you were desperate to uphold, while tossing your eldest daughter into the shadows. My mother began to cry. But I no longer felt anything toward those tears. "I spent years living as the shadow of your golden sun. I used to believe that if I just worked harder, you'd finally see me. But eventually I realized the problem wasn't that I wasn't good enough." I walked to the door and placed my hand on the handle. "The problem was, you never wanted to see me." I opened the door. Light flooded in, bright, warm, and undeniable. Before stepping out, I turned back one last time. "From now on, I will handle this merger as a CEO, not as the daughter still begging for validation from a family that forgot she existed." And I walked away. No looking back, no regrets. As I stepped out of that room, the sound of the door closing behind me felt like an old rusted latch snapping in half, dry and final, but ringing with truth. What once was called family, blood, and foundation had now become echoes of a shattered belief. The wedding reception went on, as if nothing had happened. The music returned, guests unsure of the drama continued sipping wine, exchanging pleasantries that suddenly felt hollow. But I knew the glances cast my way and toward Daniel were no longer the same. They carried a mixture of curiosity and malicious delight, the way people react when an unexpected climax interrupts an otherwise ordinary play. I lifted my head and walked toward the bar, where James Harrison was waiting, his hand resting on a glass of wine he hadn't touched. As I approached, he tilted his head and offered a knowing smile, the kind of smile someone gives after watching a perfect checkmate unfold. "You surprised me, Emily," he said quietly, just loud enough for only me to hear. "I already thought you were sharp in business, but today I saw a masterclass in timing that puts the media to shame." I gently clinked my glass against his, neither smiling nor denying it. "Well then, James," I said in a low voice, "shall we begin negotiations on Monday?" He nodded, his gaze sharp as a blade. "And perhaps we'll need to reassess the entire leadership team at Sterling." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. 3 days later, I was in my office on the top floor of Lyra's Chicago headquarters when I heard a familiar knock, 3 quick beats, urgent. "Come in," I said, eyes still on the screen displaying Sterling Dynamics' organizational chart. Of course it was Daniel. Gone was the polished suit and confident stride. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, eyes sunken with fatigue. He looked like a man who had endured a 3-day hangover, without alcohol, only truth, and an unrelenting freefall. "I need to talk," he said, dropping into the chair without waiting to be invited. "About everything." I closed my laptop, crossed my arms, and met his gaze. "I'm listening." He swallowed hard, as if the words had lodged in his throat. "That day, you were right. I didn't build anything. Everything was handed to me. I never had to hold anything together on my own." I stayed silent. For the first time, Daniel wasn't speaking like a spoiled younger brother. He spoke like a man finally coming to terms with the most painful truth of his life. "I know the merger's happening. I know I may not keep my job." He paused. "But I want to start over. From scratch." I looked at him for a long time. I had waited for those words, Not because I wanted to see him fall, but because I wanted him to understand. Success isn't a privilege. It's something earned. Good, I said. Lyra doesn't reward connections. We only keep those with real potential and a willingness to relearn everything. Daniel nodded slowly, as if stitching back together the torn pieces of his pride. So, where do I start? I pulled a folder from my drawer and slid it across the desk toward him. Sales department, position, junior associate, entry-level pay, no private office, no custom business cards. He took the folder, his hands slightly trembling. You're serious? I nodded. Very. This isn't punishment. It's your one chance to find out what you really have and what you're willing to lose. That afternoon, I got a call from my mother. I didn't answer. 15 minutes later, my father called. Then came a message, then an email, all with the same plea, repeated over and over. We need to talk. We're family. It can't end like this. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because I finally understood. When someone only reaches out after you gain power, it's not a connection. It's a transaction. And I've had enough of transactions to last a lifetime. By sunset, golden light spilled across the windows of the top floor. I stood before the tall glass, looking out at a city glittering with ambition and opportunity. Behind me sat the merger files, the list of displaced executives, and Daniel's job application. Ahead of me, an open sky. No one to shield me, no one to chart the course. Only me, alone, but never lonely. And in that moment, I realized collapse doesn't begin with the fall. It begins the moment someone believes they'll stand above it all. Forever. Monday morning. The 48th floor of the tallest glass building in northern Chicago was bathed in soft golden sunlight. The white curtains had been drawn back, revealing a hazy skyline in the distance, where the sun's reflection shimmered across Lake Michigan like a strip of molten glass. I stood by the glass wall, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the conference table. Laid out before me was a thick dossier, the merger between Lyra Consulting and Sterling Dynamics, a product of nearly a year of quiet planning, and one explosive night no one had seen coming. The CEO's chair no longer felt cold like the first time I sat in it. It had molded to me. It held the breath of sleepless nights, the sting of near failures, the weight of meetings where no one believed me, and the quiet tears no one ever saw. Today was the full board meeting, and for the first time, I wouldn't walk in as the modest big sister my family once knew. I would walk in as exactly who I am, Emily Walker, the woman who built an empire out of everything no one thought mattered. A soft knock at the door. Emma, my assistant, peeked in, polite as always. Mr. Daniel Walker has arrived. He's waiting outside the conference room. I nodded. Give him the prep materials and don't bring him coffee like usual. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. She understood. This time, Daniel didn't need to be served. If he wanted to start from scratch, then every privilege, no matter how small, had to be earned again. I entered the conference room right on time. 20 people sat around the long table, each with a different expression. Curiosity, doubt, some with a quiet nod of respect. But what I saw most clearly in their eyes was the shift, from skepticism to trust. James Harrison was the first to stand, shaking my hand, his smile no longer just a formality. We're officially beginning, Emily, he said. You're leading. I opened my laptop and projected the strategy document onto the large screen. I didn't need a script, no cue cards. Every line of that plan was a part of me. I'd written it in experience, in pain, and in faith I had to rebuild alone. Department by department, employee by employee, asset by asset, I presented the full structure, not a stutter. Each word I spoke wasn't just numbers or strategy, it was principle. Lyra wasn't just acquiring a company, it was redefining its core value, merit above all else. When we reached the section on Sterling leadership restructuring, I paused. The room held its breath. I displayed the list. Who would remain, who would be reassigned, and who would be let go. Daniel Walker's name appeared in none of the categories. A blank space, an open decision. I turned to Mr. Harrison. "As for Mr. Daniel Walker," I said calmly, "Lyra will neither terminate nor favor him. He will undergo the standard probationary process, 6 months. If he doesn't meet the performance criteria, the contract terminates automatically." Several nods followed, quick, firm, final. I turned to the glass wall. Outside, Daniel sat in the waiting room, his face turned toward me. His eyes no longer carried the panic of a man who had fallen, but the clarity of someone finally seeing the true height of what he once believed was the top. After the meeting, I returned to my office. Daniel was there, waiting. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said. There was no excuse in his tone, no arrogance. I didn't smile, I didn't offer comfort. I simply nodded. "Don't thank me," I replied. "Thank yourself, if you truly earn it." He bowed his head. For the first time in his life, it wasn't an act. That evening, after everyone had left, I stayed an extra hour. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old photograph, a family photo I'd always kept hidden in a hard folder. In it, I stood slightly off to the side, wearing a beige thrifted dress, my expression lost among a family smiling like they already had everything. I was no longer that girl in the picture. I folded the photo carefully, placed it back in the box. Not to forget, but to remember. To remember where I came from, and why I'm not going back. Today, I lived fully as myself, not to prove anything to anyone, but to finally step out from the shadows that clouded my youth. I don't need anyone to light the way for me anymore. I am the light. I never invited them, because I knew eventually they would come on their own. On Wednesday morning, before the sunlight had reached the glossy wooden floor of my office, Emma stepped in, bowing her head slightly as if afraid to disturb me. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker are here," she said softly. "They said it's a family matter." I looked up from my screen, unsurprised. "Send them in," I said, my voice steady. No different than for any other meeting. I could imagine Emma's expression then, a flicker of hesitation, a hint of concern, but she didn't question. She just nodded and stepped out. Moments later, the door opened again. My parents walked in, as if they'd gotten lost in a world that no longer belonged to them. My father wore his usual gray suit, but without the confidence of a man used to making decisions for others. My mother clutched her handbag so tightly her fingers had gone pale. She didn't look directly at me at first, but scanned the office. Abstract paintings on the wall, neatly arranged glass trophies on the shelf, each item telling a story she had never taken the time to hear. I didn't stand. "I have 30 minutes before my next strategic meeting," I said, not coldly, but without softness. "Let's get to the point." My mother sat down first, hands still trembling. My father hesitated, then reluctantly took the seat beside her. "Emily," she began, her voice cracking as though she were relearning how to say my name. "I'm sorry for everything. For what we didn't see, didn't say, didn't do." I stared at her without blinking. My father spoke next, picking up where she left off. "We made many mistakes, but your brother, our family, we can't let work tear us apart. Let's go back to how things used to be." I let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was deeply sad. "Back to how things were?" I repeated. I stood and walked over to the bookshelf, pulling down an old photo frame. It was the same family photo I had once kept tucked away. Me, off to the left, wearing a faded beige dress, my eyes unfocused, as if searching for someone or wishing to disappear. The rest of them were smiling. I set the frame on the desk, facing them. "Do you see anything?" My mother's eyes welled with tears. My father said nothing. "This photo is our family. Before. And it's also where I learned that indifference kills trust. Slowly, day by day, year by year." I walked toward the window, looking out over the city below, a place full of people fighting each day just to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. I had once been one of them. When I was exhausted, no one asked. When I failed, no one noticed. When I succeeded, the first thing anyone said was, "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" My voice wasn't raised, but every word fell heavy, like ice melting into the silence. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" I turned to face them. "Because no one was ever listening." My mother cried. This time it was real. Not the kind of crying reserved for awkward family dinners. Not the kind meant to deflect questions. This was the cry of someone who had realized she'd lost something not easily reclaimed. "What do you want from us?" my father asked, his voice hoarse. It no longer carried the condescension I once hated, only fatigue and confusion. I didn't answer right away. I returned to my seat, placed both hands on the table, like a CEO closing a deal that had remained unresolved for years. "I don't want anything," I said. "Not an apology, not redemption, and certainly not forced closeness pretending nothing happened." I paused, then added slowly, "I just want you both to understand, when I walked out of that house, I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I realized I had to find my own worth, because no one else was going to find it for me." They said nothing. In the golden morning light filtering through the windows, I could see time etched clearly on their faces, the wrinkles, the hollow spaces no money or title could fill. I opened a drawer, pulled out a thin folder, and slid it across the table toward them. "This is a new employment contract for Daniel, if he's willing to start over from the very bottom." My mother looked up, stunned. "You're still giving him a chance?" I nodded, calm. "I'm not here to punish. I'm here to build." They left not long after. No more words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. I remained alone in my office. Behind me was a family that once forgot I existed. Ahead of me, a journey I no longer had to walk alone, not because they had returned, but because I'd stopped needing their validation. Now, I only needed myself. And that was enough. 9:00 a.m. The 46th floor of Sterling Dynamics headquarters blazed under the ceiling lights. Every chair in the main boardroom was filled. Members of the board, senior advisors, department heads, and legal representatives from both sides. The air was thick with anticipation. Some flipped through files out of habit. Others tapped pens against the table. But most sat still, eyes fixed on the large, polished black doors slightly ajar at the head of the room. And then, the doors opened. I walked in. No introduction. No greeting. The sound of my heels striking the wood floor echoed deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the room. My jet black suit was perfectly tailored, not to draw attention, but to send a message. I wasn't here as part of any family. I was here as a force of my own. James Harrison rose and nodded, a silent ritual. I sat down at the head of the table, opened my laptop, placed the files in front of me, and looked directly at the room. Then I began. I presented the merger strategy, not with the words of an upstart leader, but with the voice of someone who had lived through every number, every market shift, every crisis that had nearly crushed Lyra Consulting in its early days. No one interrupted. All I saw were nods, eyes shifting from skepticism to respect. When I reached the executive restructuring section, I paused. The next slide appeared, bold title across the top, Rebuilding from the Ground Up, Merit over Privilege. I read aloud, "All leadership positions at Sterling will be reevaluated based on actual performance over a 6-month period. Any privilege gained through personal relationships, marriage, or internal legacy will be nullified." The room tightened like a drawn bowstring. Someone swallowed hard. Others glanced down at their files as if hoping to find reassurance. I continued, "Executive roles will be reallocated. Those who fail to meet KPIs, whether the CFO, HR head, or vice president, will be removed. Lyra retains no one out of blind loyalty." I didn't need to name names. They knew. I glanced at the side window. Outside, in the observation room, my parents and Daniel sat watching. They didn't know I could see them, but I saw clearly. My mother sat upright, clutching her purse, her gaze unblinking. My father's arms were crossed, his face stiff, as if masking something long overdue. And Daniel, he sat slumped forward, not from fatigue, but because he finally understood what it felt like to be unseen. A feeling I'd known all my life. I spoke again, slower this time. Some roles will be replaced. Some individuals will be given a chance to start again, from the very bottom. Among them, I paused, is someone from my own family. No one spoke. I looked straight at the board. Power only has value when placed in the hands of those who earn it, and trust only has meaning when it isn't built on blood. The meeting stretched another hour. When I stood to close the session, everyone stood with me, a silent recognition. Harrison shook my hand again, this time no longer ceremonial, but sincere. "You've steered this ship into new waters," he said, "and frankly, it needed that long ago." I didn't reply. I just smiled, the kind of smile not born of triumph over others, but of victory over myself. Outside, Daniel was waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't defend himself. He simply handed me the intern contract he'd signed. Not torn, not a single clause crossed out. "I start tomorrow," he said. I nodded. No praise, no comfort. I'd given him the opportunity. How far he went, that was on him. My parents didn't approach. They stood at a distance. My mother's eyes were red. My father watched me with a look more complex than 1,000 words. I turned away and walked. No looking back. It wasn't necessary anymore. Back in my office, I stood before the familiar glass wall. Below, the city pulsed with life. The world moved on, unbothered by anyone's personal journey. I placed a hand over my chest, where my grandmother's pendant still lay, warm and gentle, like a timeless whisper. "They don't need to see you shine. You just need to know that you do." And today, I didn't need reminding. I knew. I had reached the summit, not by standing on anyone's shoulders, but by carving the stones beneath my feet and building every step on my own. That evening, I returned to the office earlier than usual. The top floor of Lyra was quiet, bathed only in the soft glow of a small desk lamp reflecting off the polished glass surfaces. The noise, voices, reports, meetings, and the eyes of others had all retreated behind closed doors, leaving behind a rare silence, a stillness that felt real in a way nothing else ever did. I walked over to the bookshelf and slid open the hidden drawer at the bottom. Inside was an old wooden box, the only item in the room that didn't bear the Lyra logo, that wasn't branded by Success. I lifted the lid and took out a tarnished silver locket, the last keepsake from the grandmother I loved most. Carefully, I opened it. Inside was a small folded note, the ink slightly smudged in one corner from tears I'd shed years ago. But the words remained. "Success isn't when others believe in you. It's when you believe in yourself, enough not to need anyone's approval." I sat down, gently brushing my fingers over the locket. A quiet sense of peace washed over me, not the artificial peace of family dinners filled with empty well-wishes, but the grounded serenity of leaning back against the values I had built with my own hands. My phone buzzed softly. A message from Emma. "Your family has left. They didn't say anything. They just stood at the glass on the 46th floor for a long time." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they had seen. A woman, not in silk gowns or glowing titles, walking into a room they once believed wasn't meant for her. Stepping into a role they once said wasn't fit for a daughter. Leading a transformation they never had the courage to embrace, even though they helped create the very problems that needed fixing. And then they stood there, not speechless from confusion, but because for the first time they saw her, clearer than ever before. The daughter they once saw as small had grown, not in the way they hoped, but in the way they were never able to comprehend. I stood and walked toward the large window, looking out over a city lighting up for the night. I didn't wish for them to come back. I didn't need them to change. What I needed was simply for them to know that everything they ever said about me, every dismissive glance, every comparison, every "your brother is the family's real hope," none of it remained a wound anymore. It had become a fortress, solid, impenetrable. I returned to my desk, folded the locket closed, and placed it back in the box. Turned off the lights, left the office. No farewell, no echoing footsteps. Just a woman quietly leaving a space she built with her own hands, walking with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly who she is and no longer needs anyone to confirm it. Tomorrow, the headlines will talk about a multi-million-dollar merger. Analysts will write about the mysterious female CEO who once hid behind an unknown name. There will be interviews, awards, invitations. But tonight, only I will know, the greatest thing I achieved was not the deal itself. It was this moment, when I no longer needed an apology, when I no longer needed them to say I was worthy, when I no longer needed validation from the outside, because I, finally, had accepted myself. And that was the last thing they saw.